60s, I think it was, I began to introduce a more formal geometric aesthetic to his work. In 1963, he moved from Germany to Paris to study at École des Beaux-Arts, and there approached the Meteorological Institute of Paris, intrigued by the idea of making art with a computer, and gained access to their equipment to generate his first plotter drawings. These then immediately gained critical acclaim, and the 1971 exhibition of Mohr's at the Museum of Modern Art in Paris is now widely recognized as the first solo exhibition in a major museum of drawings made entirely by the computer. Mohr is in both our upstairs exhibition and our exhibition next door. I'm thrilled that he is here to be with us tonight, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Manfred Mohr.
You almost said everything. Music is in my life one of the most important things. And everything I do in my life has somehow always a connection to music. And my art is no exception. I remember when I was a kid and I discovered Anton Webern, who uses the space or the silence as an equal partner to sound. So it's like 0 and 1. And at that time, of course, I didn't think of 0 and 1, but I was so impressed that silence could be an opposite to a sound. And of course, my whole life turned around jazz. And I was a jazz musician for many years, and I played tenor saxophone in a group. And when I was in art school, I always tried to paint something and play it. Or I played at night in the club, and the next day I wanted to paint this kind of stuff. I thought I did that, but at least I had the intention to do things like this. But in one word I could say I'm a child of the expressionism, of the abstract expressionism of the 50s. And I was very comfortable with that. But then one day something happened. I somehow got hold of books from a German philosopher. His name is Max Bense. And Max Bense, he talked about a lot of things, about how to measure art. But one thing he was talking about is to create a rational and logical art. And it just blew my mind. What is that? It was exactly the opposite what I was doing. I was an emotional action painter, and this guy talks about rationality and logic. And it was so impressing to me that I could not get rid of the thinking. But it took me years to understand what he meant. Only retrospectively, if I look now at my old work from the early 60s, I could see how his influence became visible in my action painting. Suddenly there was a little triangle somewhere, or a square, or a straight line which I drew with a ruler. So that became more and more important, and by the mid-60s my whole artwork was geometrical, completely geometry. I cut out elements and moved them around on the canvas to build tension, spots and something like this, but it still was not logical. It was still not that what Bense was talking about. And then another thing happened. I met this French composer, Pierre Barbeau, and he was the first person in Europe, at least as much as I know, who composed music by writing programs and running on a computer. And that blew my mind. And I suddenly realized, boy, that's what Bense is talking about. And he gave a lecture somewhere and invited me to this public lecture. And there was a whole bunch of people here, and everybody got completely out of his mind. that this is possible. And we met the next day again, and that was, by the way, the birthday of the seminar in the faculty in Evanston. It was called Area Informatique, and I think it still exists nowadays. But anyway, we were people coming together to discuss what could we do. I mean, nobody knew programming, nobody had a machine. I mean, to have a computer, computers were this big as this room at the time, it cost $10 million. So what could we do? We discussed, and I sort of got a little impatient. I was discussing, and so we tried to learn programming. So how do we learn programming? That wasn't an easy job because there was no school. So there were about 2 or 3 books available, so I bought them and I learned to practically memorize them. But I still had no computer. So how could I get to a computer? And then one evening I watched television, and they had this program where they showed the Meteorology Institute in Paris that they just got a machine which can draw the weather map connected to a computer. And I jumped up and said, that's it! I need that machine! And literally the next day I ran into this institute and wanted to talk to the director. And of course, it didn't work that way. Very nice. And said, okay, write a letter, explain what you want, and I did. And you won't believe it. A week later, I got a letter from the Ministry of Transport that I had a rendezvous with the minister. I couldn't believe it. So I went there, and it went very well. And he listened to what I wanted to say, that I wanted to make research and art and design. And he was so favorable. He said, okay, you can come after hours. You can have anything you want. And suddenly I had the most powerful machine in the world. And the plotter, big flatbed plotter. I mean, that was incredible. It was paradise. I was probably the only artist in the world who had this kind of luck. So I started working there almost for the next 11 years, almost every night. When even the drawings you have up there, they're from that time. So the other lucky strike which happened is that I met at this time my future wife, Esther. She was a mathematician and also knew about programming. And she taught me the rest of it, what I had to need to write programs. And also she knew the machine, what meteorology had, because she worked at Brookhaven before and they had the same machine. So she knew exactly what I have to do. So that was a fantastic thing. So, like you mentioned, this went on, and then the art world sort of looked around, and most of my friends and most of my colleagues, they turned away and thought I'm crazy, and I lost it completely, and that's not art what you're doing. But it never bothered me, because it was always the question, but is it art? I never understood this question, because I'm doing what I want to do. This is my aesthetic expression, so who cares if it's art or not? That's not my problem. Maybe their problem, but not mine. But on the other hand, there's no artist in the world who makes a line and says, is this now art or not art? That's not the problem for an artist. What he's doing his work and wants to create something. And that's what I did, and that's why I never had any problem with any. I just did my work with the computer, that's what I do. And then this director of the museum was one of the persons who thought, when I saw that this is something maybe interesting, and he came and visited me at the Institute, and he made me that show in the museum, which was, like you said, the first one-man show. And that was a real, I mean, nowadays it's almost impossible to feel that, because having a show of work which is entirely drawn by a computer and created by computer, it's nowadays not a big deal. But then it was a revolution. People got aggressive, people threw things at me, and yelled at me, and called me, I mean, anything you can imagine. They said, how could you use a military machine to make art? You're a trader. How could you use a bourgeois machine? It's incredible. It was so hostile. And all the magazines turned like, whenever the word computer came up, Nobody wanted to hear anything. So I decided, okay, if they don't want to know about computers, I call it something else. And I called it generative work, generative drawings. But then after a while I saw too, they all looked blank, because nobody knew what I'm talking about. So then I decided, okay, maybe I should call it nothing. It's just my work. And that's what I did, and I had shows, and people accepted it. And one day even a man came in the show, I had a show, and he put his arm around and said, "Can I suggest something? You should use a computer." If I had been a man, I would have kissed him. But that's the other side. So my first programs I wrote were all orientated to my latest works in geometry, my geometric works, and also my idea about music scores and writing. So I wrote all these algorithms, and I had really, it worked very easily for me, and I made hundreds of programs, and then I thought that can't be it. There should be something more global to the whole thing. And again, I went back to the music and thought, if I play on the piano, it doesn't matter what I play. If I bang with a wrist or take a hammer, it always sounds like a piano. If I play my saxophone, no matter what I do, everybody can hear it's a saxophone. So why couldn't I invent a graphic instrument which always sounds graphic? An instrument which is a logic in itself, and whatever I do to it, even if I rip it apart, it's still that system, and it shows it. And I came to the idea of the cube. The cube is a basic system. No matter how many lines I rip off or do something with it, it's still a cube, and it's a system which is correct in itself, and I practically cannot make an error. It's always right. So I developed all sorts of programs in this direction. I did statistical research, like for example, drawing 1,000 cubes in a matrix and only showing 10% of the lines. That's suddenly a visual thing which you never saw before. What happens there? And then you say 20%. Well, it becomes a completely different thing. And I saw that I have to completely relearn all I learned in art school. I had to approach this whole visual domain in a completely different view of things. And I went on and made fantastic drawings. I thought they were fantastic. But again, something happened that I thought, okay, the cube is interesting. But how about if I make it more complicated, like a piano with 100 keys or 200 keys? So I went one dimension higher in the fourth dimension. Not that I'm interested in the mystic or metaphysical stuff, that I'm not interested in, nor in the mathematics of it, but I'm interested in the structure. And the structure is 8 cubes which are intertwined, they have sides together and stuff like this. So it's a system which is suddenly 8-fold from a cube. And I had much more possibilities to do. And I did also there all sorts of algorithms. I used graph theory, and I even built a program in molecular sort of growth of this kind of stuff. And over the years, I went one dimension higher than the other, and I landed at one point in the 6th dimension. In the 6th dimension, there are only 120 cubes. So with this 120 cubes, of course, since my whole idea was always that I never show the totality of something, only aspects of it, I mean a subset. And I always put everything down into 2 dimensions to get into ambiguity. Because in ambiguity, there is no front and back, and it becomes a pure sign. And that's what I was interested in. So I developed all these kind of things, and combinatorial, and whatever you want. And I calculated a thing called diagonal path, which is a line through the structure which passes once through every dimension, and it becomes these zigzag lines. And it was a fantastic alphabet suddenly for me. And I put, for example, 4 of the zigzags together and rotated them, and I cut them out with a laser out of steel and made wall reliefs. And it was really fantastic, but one thing happened again. It became more and more minimal. And how could I explain that 5 lines is very complex? And I lost the complexity. I wanted to show the complexity. So how could I show a complexity with these things? And then I had this idea that if I would color the space between these diagonal paths in random fashion, let the computer decide what color, I would get a distinction of these spatial aspects. And maybe that would work, that people would feel that it's complicated, that it's a complicated space, and it worked. I mean, I was shocked myself. And when I woke up in the morning and saw these things on the floor and said, who was here last night? It would work. But of course, all my galleries and everybody got heart attacks because they, after 35 years being black and white, suddenly comes and makes the most incredible, horrible colors you can imagine, you know. But for me, that was very important because I didn't have a color problem. I wanted distinction. So for me, even the worst colors was the best because they distinct each other. So I was very happy with the work, and okay, my environment had a little bit hard time for a while, but then they accepted it, and that I made it then moving. I built my first screen work that I moved the spaces very slowly in space, and it became even more visible how complex this stuff is and how incredible strong that the idea was. And then I went even more higher, the 11th dimension. And there, you have 42,000 cubes, so that's a lot of cubes. So, of course, since I only look at aspects of things, I wrote an algorithm which chooses a certain amount of cubes. And the algorithm also decided which sides of this so many cubes are black and white. And then I rotated the whole structure in front of a green background. And sometimes, since the structure is not complete, there's a hole you can look through. So, in a sense, what happened is like leaves on a tree. When the sun shines, they overlap and they build a big shadow on the floor. So these works which are hanging out there is, in this sense, a shadow from the 11th dimension. Because all the white and all the black is adding each other up, you know, and rotate them in space. And now my latest work, which is not here, which I just showed in Germany, that involves 2 square screens. And there is, on the right screen, there are diagonal paths again, which have different line widths and also different colors. And every 10 seconds, everything changes. The amount of lines changes, and the colors change randomly. And every time the change happens, an image gets sent to the left screen. And that left screen kept the image for 10 seconds until the next one came. So it was on one side the creation of the sign and the slideshow on the other side. And I found this incredibly fantastic, like a jazz pianist would play. With the right hand he plays the melodic stuff, with the left hand he puts the harmonies in it. So that's what I'm doing right now. So I think that's all I have to say tonight. Thank you very much.